Right, we'll get underway. Welcome tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Mike Smith tōku ingoa. I'm the Secretary of the Fabian Society, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight to tonight's presentation with Brian Easton. Brian, some little time ago, sent us a paper to put up on our website based on his book In Open Seas, which he's got here for those of you who wish to purchase one at a very steep discount price. And it was an analysis of the Ardern Hipkins Labour government and why it wasn't a transforming government. And we put the article up on the website, but in conversation with Brian, I asked him to actually not so much look back, but look forward. And I think as one who's lived through the 40 years or so of the neoliberal experiment, we are actually not only in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also in the world at another conjuncture where greater possibilities could be on the horizon if we are wise enough to address them. And certainly in Brian, we have somebody who's made an enormous contribution to our thinking, and back in the days when we worked in the Engineers Union to our acting. So it's a great privilege and pleasure to have Brian give us the next version looking forward. So thank you very much, Brian. Over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I thank the Fabian Society for the invitation to speak on some of my recent writing and lifetime thinking, and thank you for coming. You'll hear that my voice projection has limitations. It's the result of surgery which removed cartilage from the larynx. I had excellent healthcare treatment, and I thank those who contributed to it. I'm not alone at reporting the excellence once one is inside the system. It's a reminder that we don't have crises in healthcare. The system has specific problems. Talking about crisis really addresses those problems, but allows ignoramuses to ineffectively redisorganise the health system, as this government is doing, as the last government did. Elaborating that story is for another occasion. In the interim, it's important we keep saying how good New Zealand healthcare is while trying to. There are downsides. The successful surgery means that on occasions like today, I have to conserve my voice. So I've asked my good friend and long-term colleague, Jerry Mushin, to read the presentation. Jerry taught economics at Victoria University of Wellington for many years. He was considered one of his best teachers. He's a writer in retirement, including publishing economic texts, a novel, children's stories, and most recently, a memoir entitled An Unlikely Academic. Those of you who attended university were not inside will read a story of what really goes on behind the scenes, not without humour, not without insights. Those of you who have been inside will recall similar events, sometimes painfully, others with amusement. Thank you, Jerry. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Brian, for that generous introduction. I'm not sure if I need a microphone. I do? Yes. All right. Is this it?
Would you like this?
No, I think no. Well, Looks like a piece of medical equipment. What do you do? Like that? All right? No, I don't know. No. Help me. I've never used one of these before. All right, I'll put that in a pocket. Here we go. Well, we won't ask you to remove your jacket or trousers. Here. Right. Okay, here we go. It sounds rather loud to me. Is it okay? Okay. The New Zealand Fabian Society has posted Brian Easton's paper entitled Transforming New Zealand, Why Has the Left Failed?, which is a follow-up from his recently published book, In Open Seas, How the New Zealand Labour Government Went Wrong, 2017 to 2023. The paper points out that the left no longer dominates the economic policy agenda. This paper is a response to Mike Smith's challenge to him, how to get the left back to being a progressive force responding to ongoing change, rather than just defending the status quo. This paper does not spend a lot of time putting the case that New Zealand's economic agenda is now dominated by neoliberal economics. Typically, the left's response to a policy announcement is that it hurts someone and that our side can do it better, implicitly accepting the existing policy framework. You rarely hear that the policy approach is fundamentally flawed, with an alternative approach being advanced. Recall that the Labour Party campaigned in 1935 on "We Have a Plan." Do you remember their slogans in the last 3 elections? Isn't each saying, "In it for us"? The it being running the country, much the same, but by a Labour leadership. Jacinda Ardern said that her government was going to be transformational, but it was so bereft of policy direction that when it took over in 2017, it set up a series of committees of the worthy and the loyal, but hardly innovative, to tell them what to do. Basically, each accepted the existing agenda and tinkered with it. Transformational, the Ardern-Hipkins government was not. That is why it has been easy for the Luxon coalition government to unravel its good intentions. The left's origins go back to a response to the capitalist industrialization that began in the 19th century. Industrialization had a revolutionary impact on society and on the lives of ordinary people, disrupting traditional social networks and the way that people lived and worked, very often making them worse off. So, how to cope with the industrialization juggernaut? One response was to return to an idealized rural Arcadia. Its best-known advocate was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, but many people voted with their feet, including those who migrated from Europe to New Zealand to go farming. A second response was revolutionary, to overthrow the social order and impose a new one. Prominent among the advocates were Marxists and hardline anarchists. However, the most successful response was the evolutionary one of adapting the social system so that the economic growth from industrialization would benefit the masses. Among the prominent British advocates at the end of the 19th century were the Fabians, named after the Roman general Fabius, who won through persistence and wearing the enemy down by attrition, rather than in pitched battle. Its logo was a tortoise. The Fabian approach has been a foundation of social democracy. Policies had a major influence on the balance-laden first Liberal government via William Pember Reeves, New Zealand's earliest acknowledged Fabian. The The influence continued through to the Savage Fraser first Labour government. After that, it seemed to the left a matter of tidying up the unfinished business, as occurred under Nash Nordmeyer second Labour government and the Kirk-Rowling third Labour government. About this time, there evolved a view that it was possible to manage the economy, ameliorating the business cycle and the accelerating inflation. The left claimed that they could do this better because they were more pragmatic than the right about government intervention. However, New Zealand conservative right is pragmatic too, and there has been a convergence of policies. One difference was that the left thought that some groups were being left out of the rising prosperity. The right disagreed. Government spending patterns through time show that the main difference between the two was that Labour governments spent more on security transfers, and research sometimes confirms popular prejudices. But the spending patterns on education and healthcare and so on were very similar, and so research does not always confirm popular prejudices. However, the traditional left success ceased to be a progressive force and instead became a defender of the status quo that its predecessors had created. Its message is, we've made these gains against capitalist industrialization, who are trying to reverse them. We are resisting. There was a deviation from this Labour tradition when the Long E. Douglas fourth Labour government adopted neoliberal or Rogernomics economic strategies. And these were continued by the fourth National government pursuing policies that became known as euthanasia and genocide after Ruth Richardson and Jenny Shipley. Michael Cullen's memoir, Labour Saving, explains that the Clark-Cullen fifth Labour government was about restoring traditional social democrat approaches. Right, do you want to show the first screen? There you go. Post-industrialization society. While the industrialization phase of modern economic growth may be over, there are other forces transforming the world. Perhaps none is as powerful as was the 19th century industrialization. We don't know because we're in the middle of it all, but collectively they are significant. And these include increasing affluence and diversity, the shift from the consumption of goods to the consumption of services, rising organizational and intellectual complexity, globalization or interconnection of individual economies, not just trade and investment, labor mobility. Labor mobility is a big one. The balance of international power is changing. The rise of the power of the financial sector, generating rising inequality at the top of the wealth distribution with political impacts. And the increasing depletion of environmental resources, of which climate change, the consequences of using the atmosphere as a sump for carbon emissions, is the big one. The left has had some responses to these transformational drivers, but frequently they amount to reacting conservatively to preserving a status quo from the past, pretending that these changes are trivial. Now, this contrasts with adapting and harnessing the forces to enable well-being for the future, in the way that their 19th century predecessors succeeded in doing. It's more prudent than Fabian. Of course, there are exceptions. Members of the Green Party, in particular, are concerned with environmental challenges. The movement is split in the way that the 19th century left was split: reversion, revolution, and evolution. It is perfectly honourable politics to defend the status quo, twiddling some of the settings, promising to do it better. That is the role of conservatives. The indications are that when Labour takes this strategy, it will be in office about a third of the time. but it will not be in power. It will neither be progressive nor transformational. It would be a rejection of the great tradition of the left to be an agent of change, and even more concerningly, that there will be a continuation of the ongoing divergence between the changing world and New Zealand's response to it. Eventually, that leads to an economic and social breakdown. Thus, the neoliberal agenda promoted by the ACT Party, which is driving some of the most divisive policies that New Zealand has faced since Rogernomics. That was their baby too. Time permits looking at only one of these challenges. It would take a series of lectures in the 19th century Fabian tradition to deal with all the forces, or you could read it in Brian's book, In Open Seas. So, how to meet the challenge of increasing affluence and diversity? The Ardern Hipkins government tried to be transformational in a couple of relevant areas, although it failed to get them underway. But there was an area where the Ardern Hipkins government was taking exactly the wrong direction, even though it was pursuing a conventional New Zealand left-wing government strategy. Right, you've got to put the next one on. Oh, you have, right, sorry. It may be that today there is more social diversity, age, class, ethnicity, gender, life experience, and religious belief, among many dimensions, greater social diversity than in the past. It is certainly more challenging. Society can no longer operate on the assumption that what is good for white, middle-class, Protestant, straight men is good for everyone. One factor driving this diversity has been affluence. Today, someone will, on average, have double the material income of their grandparents. One chapter of In Open Seas wonders whether that will be true in the future. Doubling purchasing power does not mean doubling everything. Spending on some things rises by much more, changing the shape of consumption and society. As In Open Seas explains, affluence generates choice, which generates diversity of consumption, behaviour, opportunity, and social display. The Ardern Hipkins government favoured the centralisation of the austere world that our grandparents grew up in, where a Wellington-based centre could control just about everything. It did not foster local decision-making. It reduced local involvement by its centralisation of health provision under Health New Zealand and under the merged mega polytechnic and under its Three Waters regime. It did little about the vast, sprawling Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment and the Department of Internal Affairs, ignoring the case for smaller, single-focused organisations, such as a Ministry of Labour, Archives New Zealand and the National Library. It wanted to merge Radio New Zealand and TVNZ, despite their quite different cultures. It reduced accountability of the public sector to the public, and it failed to strengthen the Official Information Act. Do you want to go on? 19th century Fabians, here we are, 19th century Fabians supported strong local government, favouring locals making local decisions. People value control over their destinies rather than leaving decisions to an anonymous Wellington bureaucracy. It is said that Wellington houses a ministry against local government. Critical here is the concept of subsidiarity. That means that decisions should be taken at the lowest possible level. While the notion is familiar to European social democrats, a leading New Zealand left theorist said he was unaware of it. And it is not surprising that Labour is insensitive to the case for decentralisation. The strongest form of decentralisation is the use of the market. So individuals make decisions about what, when, and where they will consume. Historically, the left has been sceptical about the efficacy of the market, a position which has been reinforced by the failure of Rogernomics. Recall the British Labour Party's debate over Clause 4 in their constitution, the social ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. Even 50 years ago, it was argued that Clause 4 should be the social control of the means of production, distribution, exchange. Ownership is a means of control, but so is a socially regulated market. Excuse me. Right. When economists advocate more market, they usually do not mention that their case assumes that the income distribution, which determines the purchasing power of individuals, has to be fair. If it is not fair, an intervention limiting the market may result in a better outcome. This is the justification for many leftish interventions. Unfortunately, such interventions tend to accumulate until they end up with a Muldoon-type economy, where nobody has the foggiest idea what is going on, and Muldoon certainly didn't. Hence, the market liberalisation of Rogernomics. But that does not mean that we should ignore distributional issues, nor should we increase inequality as the Rogernomes did. Market delivery does not always work well. This is why pragmatic economists advocate more market and not all market, like the neoliberals, who even tried to Americanize the public healthcare system, despite the American healthcare system being the least successful and most expensive among affluent economies. Going down the path of decentralization would indeed be transformational. Practical income redistribution and market design are not easy. It is critical if we want to deal with local autonomy, and the growing diversity on matters like ethnicity and gender. Not in passing, decentralization is key to resolving Maori concerns, as In Open Seas explained, that was promised in the Treaty of Waitangi. We need a new policy framework where politicians stop strengthening the centre, but instead promote subsidiarity. Right. But decentralization and subsidiarity will not be successful if the income distribution is not fair. Around a quarter of New Zealanders, especially children and their guardians, cannot be described as affluent, having choice, because our redistribution system is not working well. Fairness requires addressing the tax and benefit system. At the moment, raising tax levels is not part of the public agenda. The implication is that the current system is efficient, which it is not, that the resulting income distribution is fair, which it is not, and that it raises sufficient revenue for public purposes, which it does not. This neoliberal constraint is so overwhelming that Ardern ruled out tax increases, a captain's call which cripples her government's policies, including her own. How are you getting on? All right. Her 2018 Child Poverty Reduction Act directs the government to halve child poverty over 10 years. However, neither she nor apparently anyone else involved in passing the Act seemed to realise how radical this objective was. The Act's goal was to reverse the impact of the Richardson and Shipley redistribution cuts of 1990 and 1991, which doubled child poverty. We may not need to restore pre-Rogernomics tax and benefit systems. In Open Seas reports a simpler, more effective regime. However, ultimately, the relative incomes of those at the top would be reduced. And one consequence of this would be to reduce their political power, their ability to control the public agenda, reversing the post-Rogernomics shift of the balance of political power. Because they did not understand what they were aiming to do, the Ardern-Hipkins government accomplished little reduction in child poverty. It fiddled at the margins. Whatever the benefits of providing free school lunches, it is not going to do much towards a counter-revolution against the neoliberal income distribution. The reductions during the time of the Ardern-Hipkins government were minuscule and certainly not on the track promised by the legislation. The actual track was more like that under the key English government. The Ardern-Hipkins government also got into a tangle with the proposed unemployment insurance scheme, which involves redundant workers getting short-term earnings-related compensation together with assistance towards finding a new job. Income smoothing would have given redundant workers time to adjust to their new circumstances. The upgrading of their skills would have minimised their long-term income loss and add to the competence of the labour force. Such schemes are not radical on the European continent. Some were operating half a century ago. The sensible approach is similar to our public retirement provision, with its base New Zealand superannuation and its top-up earnings-related KiwiSaver. Explained in Open Seas, it offers a path to amalgamate New Zealand's two different public income maintenance systems. Unemployment insurance by itself would be a small change, but it opens up the possibility of extending ACC to cover sickness, as recommended by the Woodhouse Commission 60 years ago. Apparently, the officials working on the scheme couldn't see how to do it, despite it being simple and straightforward, or even to explore the possibility, indicating how unprepared we are for seriously tackling redistribution policy. There was widespread opposition to the proposal from the neoliberal right, which saw it as government intervention involving a tax increase, downgrading social insurance while supporting private insurance. But there was also opposition from some people on the left, although their understanding of the background and history was so confused that it was difficult to know what their concerns were. And so the unemployment insurance scheme was abandoned in the February 2023 policy bonfire. No explanation for the decision was given to us. The left tiptoes around the issue of economic distribution. Sure, there is a case for a more progressive tax structure, a capital gains tax, and a wealth tax. Brian Easton was discussing these 5 decades ago, including proposing a negative income tax. But it needs to be tackled in a comprehensive, integrated way. Instead, the neoliberal standard of no tax increases, no improvement in the efficiency of the tax system, no addressing the fairness of the tax system, and underfunding the public sector dominate the public discussion. Envy is not a part of the Social Democrats' policy. but fairness is. We need a new policy framework where politicians stop demanding that we keep taxes low, but ask about the extent to which equality and opportunity are being promoted. Excuse me. Now, economic growth and well-being. As the opening analytic chapter of In Open Seas explains, in a world of affluence and diversity, GDP per capita is no longer a good measure of well-being. The distinction is well captured by the Brazilian colonel, who, having taken much Chicago school advice, said that he couldn't understand when he was told the economy was doing well while the people were not. Now, Grant Robertson, the Minister of Finance in the Ardern Hipkins government, recognised this issue. In his first budget in 2018, he announced, quote, "We have signalled our intention to take a well-being approach. In the past, we have used GDP and traditional fiscal indicators as the only signs of success. And yet real success means much more for New Zealanders and New Zealand. Of course, a strong economy is important, but we must not lose sight of why it is important. That is why our government is making a formal change to move beyond narrow measures of economic growth and broaden the scope and definitions of progress and success." Unquote. This announcement was for a new direction in thinking about government economic management. It reflected a shift within the economics profession away from an excessive focus on material market income towards other influences on well-being. Economists were cautious about the extent to which their measures connected to well-being. On the whole, the evidence suggests that above certain income thresholds, the connection is tenuous. That is why the first analytic chapter of In Open Seas is about well-being. It warns that the notion is difficult to conceptualize, to measure, and to apply. Economists will tell you that GDP and its associated measures are hard to analyze. They are simple compared to well-being. But as Keynes said, it is better to pursue the vaguely right than the precisely wrong. And Robertson described all his subsequent 5 budgets as well-being budgets. His statement introducing the 2023 budget, which was his last, devoted 16 of its 28 pages to the well-being outlook and objectives. The term is used 69 times, yet the term well-being was not used much in Labour's 2023 election campaign. When the incoming National Minister of Finance, Nicola Willis, presented her first budget policy statement, she grumpily footnoted that a 2020 amendment to the Public Finance Act requires the government to state the well-being objectives that will guide its budget decisions. And she made but 2 desultory mentions. Her 2025 budget policy statement identifies 3 traditional and also worthy overarching goals: building a stronger, more productive economy, delivering more efficient, effective and responsive public services, and getting the government's books back in order. It added that the goals were the government's well-being objectives, as achieving them is the most important contribution the government can make to the long-term social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of New Zealanders. What this means is we are back to judging well-being in narrow economic terms. In her post-2024 budget speech, Labour's spokesman on finance said that her focus would be on household costs, small business, climate change, and roads. There is a glancing mention of well-being, equating it with intergenerational issues. So Labour is back to the same dead end as National, as the key English government, as the Luxon coalition government. After more than a year in office, the current Prime Minister has announced that his government will focus on economic growth. We can take this that it means it wants to increase GDP. There is a long history of concern about New Zealand's economic growth record, going back over 60 years before the present Prime Minister was born. It does not go back much earlier because there was no official GDP data until the 1950s. That's when modern economic growth theories began. Before then, the long-term concern was more about employment and unemployment. There is a constant rhetoric in the public debate that New Zealand's growth and productivity record is poor, and that we should adopt new policies which will stimulate and accelerate growth. It is common rhetoric in other affluent economies too. We are not unique in this respect. There is never any evidence of how the policies being promoted might work, because rhetoric sometimes replaces research. Nor is it observed that this claim has persisted over 60 years, and that there is not the slightest evidence that we have been able to increase the economic growth rate. Sure, the New Zealand economy has grown and productivity has risen, but there is no period in which long-term productivity has accelerated, especially as a result of policies. And Rogernomics demonstrates that there are policies which can slow down growth. The expectation is that this government's policies will do little to accelerate long-term productivity. It is likely that many people will go into the 2026 election poorer than they were in 2023, with the growth in GDP going to overseas investors and new immigrants. A cyclical recovery aside, the government will be looking threadbare on the economic front, although one should never underestimate the ability of a public relations team to temporarily dress up the shabby. The status quo left has submitted to the Luxon coalition government's growth agenda. The progressive left can challenge it by distinguishing well-being from growth, as Robertson was trying to do. Why did he fail? And why were his well-being budgets not transformational? One explanation is that there was not enough time to bed in the new approach. But that does not explain the Labour retreat in opposition. Robertson kept the cards close to his chest, just him and the Treasury. There was no attempt to build a wider community consensus. Brian Easton suggested to Robertson that they should have extended the Productivity Commission's remit to cover well-being. It was the only recommendation that Brian made to him. Even that was a step too far. Once more, the left is facing a challenge similar to that which it faced in the 19th century. Industrialization increased GDP while making many people worse off. Critically, it was necessary for public interventions to reduce those downside detriments. Historically, the left promoted policies to make industrializations more beneficial. The lesson remains as true today. Economic change has to be harnessed for public well-being. It does not happen automatically. We need a new policy framework where politicians stop asking how we can grow the economy, but how we can develop well-being. Rogernomics recognised, this is under the fourth Long E. Douglas Labour government, Rogernomics recognised that New Zealand had to respond to changing circumstances. The era which Muldoon represented was passed. It correctly diagnosed that this required decentralisation. However, the neoliberals incorrectly assumed that decentralisation meant only decentralisation to individuals, ignoring that it also requires getting the economic distributions right. Instead, they made them less fair, markedly increasing income inequality, preserving the incomes of the well-off at the expense of reducing the incomes of those in the middle and at the bottom. And it took 20 years for some of the poorest to recover their pre-Rogernomic income levels. Moreover, the neoliberals did not accept that subsidiarity could be to lower-level collective institutions, like local government and like unions. In many ways, the neoliberals strengthened the power of the centre by weakening the intermediate institutions between them and the people, while putting the centre more under the influence of the rich and the corporates. They were seduced by the belief that their neoliberal policies could accelerate the economic growth rate. Instead, the economy stagnated. And yet the neoliberals were transformational. They were in power for only 6 years, much the same period as the Ardern Hipkins Labour government. But unlike it, they transformed the economic policy framework and the political environment. That was because they knew what they were doing, including sterilising any opposition. They will be long remembered. Meanwhile, the sixth Labour government, already having had most of its policies reversed, will be a footnote in the pages of history. That's it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for that combined exposition. I think perhaps, Brian, what might be the best thing if we just have a general kōrero and people can respond as they wish, and then perhaps at the end sum up, and then I'll sum up. So, floor's open for people to respond in whatever way they would like. So, who would like to go? Goodness me. Jeffrey, take a mic.
You started, left response to 19th century capitalism. Now, the transformation of that industrial capitalism is no longer really the core adversary. The core adversary now is really a post-industrial, increasingly international order dominated by growth of rents and rent-seeking, elite at its core, and with very strong much stronger transnational forces at work than was the case in the 19th century. Even that's not saying the 19th century didn't have strong transnational forces. It's just that today there is a more visible international oligarchic elite, if you like. Now, framing a response to that does require a bit of redefinition of what a transformational I don't know exactly what we call this system. I call it neo-feudalism, essentially because it's moving away from a capital labour distinction with the capitalist elite and moving much more towards some out system where precarious contract labour is kept subservient by a rent class at the top. But trying to find a way of empowering the part of society under those circumstances is much more difficult in a way than empowering an organised labour force under Fordist conditions where unions provide an organisational focus, labour movement can give them a political gloss. So I'm just chucking a little challenge up to think about how you reframe a Fabian type message in the new geopolitical context.
Good, thank you. That's a great. Absolutely. Man with the mic. So, who else who would like to offer some thoughts?
I guess the problem is that part of society, and we really should start, because they're not there to serve us anymore. They're there to serve themselves and people of their ilk, which is horrifying, of course, because all we've got is, but I don't really think it's going to do us much good in the future.
Next. I think there's an interesting debate going on. I think at the moment, picking up both Brian's and Jeff's point around the question of distribution of income and the question of where economies have gone to financialise wealth. So whether we look at tax as something that should address that question of inequality of wealth directly, or a bit less indirectly. So there's, yeah, I think there are political issues that we need to grapple with as well.
Mike, thanks very much, Brian, and your helper. I just wanted to add that we seem to be moving into a state of play where, if you like, the economy transformed into a services economy. The areas, traditional areas like agriculture, have shrunk quite dramatically. It's 5% of GDP now, and still a significant part of export. There's a fundamental shift in the nature of the economy. It's Bernard Hickey puts it quite well, I think, that it's a sort of housing economy, financial housing economy with a small sort of export sector of farmers and so on attached. And that requires a total set of policies. And we're seeing that financialised economy accentuated through Luxembourg. That needs addressing directly, I think. So, you know, that it speaks to your point, Brian, about the size of government and whether we can expand tax to restore an economy and knowledge economy, for example, or just stick to housing-based financialised sector.
Thank you. Anyone else? Down the back, sorry, not coming. Right. Nice to see you.
It seems to me well-being is too vague a concept to build a campaign around. I think well-being got to be backed up by solid things like end homelessness. Solve those housing problems. They've got to be concepts people can grasp hold of and say, unemployment, end unemployment. These are basics which were true in the past. 88-year-old, I look back to the days when everybody had a job. It's a bit harder with the economy's changed, but we really to use unemployment as the chief goal of economic policy, which was many years, whether it was a Labour government or a National government. Both parties were committed to housing after the Nash government brought in those great housing policies which solved the housing problem. So I really think the well-being related to specific things which people can understand and feel that we're.
Kia ora, Easton, for those who don't know me. I'd like to sort of jump in here to sort of point out how great this is and also what I expect from have learned to expect, which is essentially the think tank of our modern society, but supported. And I think that's the question we have to ask. Is it actually being undermined in our ability through these challenges? Are having the degree to which reforms may have been public service itself, and our inability across universities and the research sector to think through what transformation really looks like and get it in place within or beyond 3-year political terms. One of the other issues there, of course, is that universities aren't exactly doing well at the moment. A lot from them. And I think it's worth something that gets a lot of traction, sadly, is that magical problems of the 20th century are just not the same solution to the problems of the 21st century, and so their budget models are falling into disrepair. At the same time, we probably need research and development. CRIs could have been a perfect model except for their tendency to get lost in consultancy and have more than 50% of their business model going there. And I worked with Bill Rosenberg, who's up in the front a while back, to get a CTU policy in front of in 2017 that set forth a 2% target. Fortunately, while that target existed, we never got close to it and are now backwards again. And I think that's an important problem, because as Hipkins' recent report points out, we're actually mostly going back to the core public research component of the program that could help us through this. So there's private ways to do it. The core public estimate of how much R&D we need to be a modern economy is around 0.7% of GDP, and we got close to that. We got over 0.5. But it's dropped back to half of that target now, by my accounting. So one of the real questions I would have is, who in this, and with Max Rashbrook gone, I'm not quite sure who to look to. And even with Max, we so often criticize things and don't spend enough of our time trying to develop solutions. What would they look like? Probably like the Zero Carbon Act that creates whole new sectors. The green sectors in the UK that said something like that for a long time are growing at 3 times the rate of the rest of the economy that's been crippled by this type of austerity we have here. Similarly, a targets regime within the RMA rather than the shifty cost-benefit analysis we've been stuck with for years might help us out. So that's my request, is start thinking about how we prioritize finding those transformational goals and investing in them. Thank you.
Kia ora, ko Paritu Tanganui Tamati. I want to say thank you to Brian Easton and your mahi. Ngā mihi, Brian. Way back in the 80s when I was at founding student of social policy, you were one of highly rated people, economists and writers that I liked. I feel hopeful, I guess, for I feel hopeful because of discussions that we're having. and looking towards and the next generation, and also looking at different values that come out of the partnership and people. In a source of looking at different value systems, look at the world and values and principles, kitanga and kaitiakitanga, and exploring the intersectionality of Papatua Nuku and looking after her and society and things like that, and exploration of different ways of looking at some of the values of looking forward into the future, having a mindset of what would benefit future generations, caring for now. But I'm excited about the next generation who have been those in kohanga serve of collectivity, and some of the principles and understanding of those young and of the towards voting. So I'm hopeful that the potential, the growing, and it.
Ngā nui. A good place to finish. So, Brian, would you offer a few thoughts, and then we'll. Oh, yeah, right. Take this one.
There's been, can you hear me? There's been a lot of diverse comments here, and perhaps I shouldn't comment on them, but I'd like to make two things. Jeff Bertram reminded us we're in the world, and a lot of our problems is how we articulate living in New Zealand with living in the world, and that includes ideologically. Rogernomics was not invented in New Zealand. They're not smart enough. They simply imitate it from overseas. So that's one thing that just right to remind us that. The second thing I'd just say to you, in open seas follows, and indeed is sort of a footnote to my earlier book, Not in Narrow Seas, which is an economic history of New Zealand. It's actually much more than an economic history, but market has required me to narrow it. And we're not aware of our economic history. And I learned a lot from that book. And if you could learn as much as I could from the book, you'd be much more radical.
Thank you, Brian. I'd like to tautoko the message of hope, I have to say, because, and just before moving to thank Brian, I think I'm reminded of the good old Gramscian story of the time of transformation, where the new order is beginning, but we haven't quite yet seen it. And one thing that I think is becoming increasingly clear is the failure of the neoliberal experiment that we've lived through for the last 40 years, and that's not been just a failure in New Zealand, but around the world. So that's going, but it's still going with a massive increase in financialisation and wealth accretion to the top. But what's starting to happen is a beginnings of a one of the more exciting political phenomena I've seen, and as many of you know, I've been involved in the Labour Party politically for a long time, is the debate that happened at the Labour Party conference late last year. And what was interesting was that it was the young ones who were coming up, who were really forcing the agenda, and they were forcing the agenda to a more radical direction. That's the first thing, I think. The second thing, I think, is that I agree absolutely with David Close, and thank you for coming from Christchurch, David, a good city councillor for so many years in socialist Christchurch, where the Fabians began in New Zealand back in the 19th century. That what will shift the political agenda is that if we come up with policies that make a real difference to the people who we want to and the problem with things like the language that we've been used, including well-being, it's lovely and it's general, but it doesn't impact the person who might be weighing up whether in South Auckland they'll bother to vote. And we have experience in the past, certainly in 2005, where we made a very deliberate campaign to take out specific policies that would make a difference to people for whom well-being and standard of living and fairness were not being shown in their lives. So the more, in my view, we get away from the generalities and down to practical, specific, concrete policies that will benefit the majority of people, and it might be that the few who've benefited from the neoliberal experiment might have to cough up a bit more, but too bad. And so that's why I think there are the beginnings of a political debate, and it's not just in the Labour Party; it's also in the Greens and in the Maori Party. So that's my response to the message of hope for the Fabians. Our next session will be with Jane Kelsey, who will undoubtedly address forcefully all those issues of financialisation, as she did in her book she presented a few years ago. And then Max Harris and Max Rashbrook, two of the upcoming forward thinkers. And later on in the year, we will hope to have a series on the next progressive majority, and we will we'll bring together Labour, Greens, Māori Party to actually look at how you actually do go about getting into power and also bringing about some policies that might make a difference. So that's just by way of my contribution to the discussion. And to say to Brian, and thank you very much, Brian, for your work over the years. I think particularly have Brian and indeed Jeff Bertram, who are people who have made an enormous contribution to our economic and political and social thinking, even though they were very, very deliberately marginalised or tried to be marginalised in the early days of the Rogernomics revolution. And I remember I'd worked in the Labour Party for about 3 weeks when Muldoon called the snap election in 1984 and celebrated the night we won the election. On the Monday after the election, I went into the Labour Party office and found a typescript copy of Economic Management, which was the Treasury blueprint for the neoliberal experiment on the party photocopier, left there by Simon Walker. So there was a coup, in my view, and people like Brian and Jeff and others were very deliberately margined. But what has been amazing, and why we need to thank them, is what they have produced and given to us over the years. So thank you very much, Brian, and indeed Jeff too. All right, so onwards and upwards until we...
This is the first time I've ever done it. I've worked as a lecturer for many years, but I didn't read aloud.
No, I did bring a glass of water.
It's a different skill.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I do just want